So welcome, good afternoon. You have landed, if you just joined us, in the Rose Library Bound with History pop-ups series with our two guests, Kevin Steele and Shawn Sheehy. So take it away, Chella.
Good afternoon, everyone. We are really excited to have you here for our first ever virtual event. As my colleague Beth said, it's the history of the pop-up books. So Beth will be introducing our speakers very shortly. I would like to mention that we do have closed captioning for the event, and we will be recording it as we mentioned in our registration email. Go ahead, Beth.
So just a quick housekeeping note. You're welcome to use the chat, but if you have specific questions for the presenters, we would welcome them in the Q&A. That makes it a little easier to keep track of questions specifically for Shawn and Kevin. And just as as an aside for people who might not be used to it, you can also upvote those questions. So if 2 or 3 people have the same question, you can kind of put a +1 on the question, and we'll make sure that those get answered after the presentations. So we're so pleased today to have Shawn Sheehy and Kevin Steele with us. Kevin Steele is an Atlanta-based graphic designer and paper engineer. From his own statement, he said his personal research focuses on movable books and paper engineering. He is interested in how structure, movement, and interaction can enhance visual communication. One of his most recent books is a collaboration on the world's first pop-up book about cannabis. Shawn Sheehy is a pop-up artist working in Chicago. In addition to his own work, Shawn is an active teacher and presenter, and he's the current president of the Movable Books Society. About his work, Shawn writes, "My books are ecological catalogs of a sort. They present collections of animals and/or plants organized by themes or systems. They advocate for the wild world. Sometimes the books are nonfiction, sometimes not." So we welcome Shawn and Kevin. I believe Kevin's going to speak first, and enjoy.
Great, thanks, Beth. Well, hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. I know Shawn and I are really excited to be here and to share our passion for pop-up books and to share a little bit of our own work as well. I wanted to start my talk by showing you some historical examples of movable books. And notice that I use the term movable books. They're not pop-up books because the idea of a pop-up book, and what you're probably thinking of, is a children's book with, when you open the page, the spread, something pops up off of the book. That's a relatively recent phenomenon in the larger history of books. It's only about 90 years old, but movable books as a broader category predates that by about 700 years. So I want to show you some examples of that and sort of what inspires me, and that will lead up to some of the work that I'm going to show you. So I'm going to start with this. This is the earliest known book that we know of that had a moving component. This is from the mid-13th century by a Benedictine monk and scribe named Matthew Paris. That's him at the bottom left there. This was a work of three volumes that he created called Chronica Mallorca, and it was essentially a history of the universe. And you can see up at the top there, some of the pages had flaps that you could fold up to reveal additional information. At the top right there, you lift that flap and you can see Noah's Ark landing on Mount Ararat. But what this book is most known for is a spinning disc, and that's what we see at the bottom right there. This is a structure called a volvelle, an Italian term just meaning something that's rotating. And this was a tool to calculate when Christian holidays would fall throughout the calendar year. So you could spin that disc and figure out when Easter and other holidays would fall. So this is mid-13th century. If we fast forward a couple hundred years, here's another famous example of a volvelle. This is Astronomicum Cesarean by Peter Appianis. And this is a pretty large work. It's about 18 or 20 inches tall, and it has these beautifully decorated volvelles, which are used to calculate planetary positions, lunar cycles, and even Halley's Comet is in here. So unlike the book that we just looked at, which was all done by hand, this one was actually printed but then all of the color that you see was done by hand. So each copy is slightly different in its coloration. There's about 100 known copies of this work. The original ones had a string that was in the center of the dial with a seed pearl at the end of it so that you could pull it out to the end to use to line up things so you could calculate different things. That you can see how beautiful this is, and it's often referred to as, you know, the most beautiful movable book ever made, or the most beautiful scientific book ever made. It's really impressive if you get a chance to see it sometime. Along that same time in the Renaissance, we started to see the use of movable books to help communicate and educate about anatomy. This work in the center here by Vesalius was part of a 7-book series. Vesalius did a series of lectures where he would dissect cadavers in front of an audience, which was unusual at the time, but that later led to these works. He would illustrate them and later, you know, print and bind them into works, but it was seen as a great advancement in the study of anatomy. On the right side there is a German ophthalmology book where you see the skull and different layers of the brain removed to eventually expose the eyeballs below that. And then on the left side from the early 20th century, this is a spread from a book showing a Cesarean section. There's also a lot of anatomy books that also show an equivalent of this, but for animals, and they were used for animal husbandry. So they could be sold to farmers, and it would show what the anatomy of, you know, cattle looks like, for instance, so they could better understand their livestock. This is a geometry book by Euclid. The original book, of course, is very old. It's from 300 BC, but this is the first English language translation from the mid-16th century. And in this edition, the printer included pasted flaps that could be folded up, so you could produce 3D models out of the proportions. So you can start to see how this is really being used as a tool to aid in communication and to help to convey ideas in a way that's perhaps stronger than if it was just printed flat in 2D. And then the last historical work I'm going to show you here is from Humphrey Repton. He was an English landscape designer of the 18th century, and he would produce what he called red books for prospective clients. And he would have these beautiful watercolor illustrations that he did himself, and he would be able to show a before and after of what he was proposing for the landscape. And it was out of a really simple device of just a flap that covers up, you know, the current situation, or it reveals what he's proposing. So it's a really simple mechanism, but it gave him a bit of showmanship. He later bound several of these pieces together in a larger book that was based on the theory of landscape design. So, you know, these different historical works that I've showed you here really inspired me when I started studying these, because, you know, it was more than just visual flash, but the structure or the moving parts really helped to communicate something about the content of these books. And that movement, or the structure of it, was just as important as the images and illustrations. It was an integrated component of those works. So I'm going to show you a few different examples of my work and how I've attempted to incorporate similar thinking in some of those pieces. So this is where I'm using it for really an educational or informational purpose. This book is called The Movable Book of Letter Forms. As Beth said, I'm a graphic designer. I taught graphic design for 6 years at Indiana University, and I created this book as a tool to introduce graphic design students to the fundamental basics of typography so they could learn about letter forms and their origins and characteristics. And I tried to use the moving parts to help illustrate that. So at the top left, we see another volvel, one of those spinning discs. The text on the left side is telling a little story about how we came about the capital letter A, the Roman A that we use today. It originally started as a pictogram of an ox's head used by the Phoenicians. And as the Phoenicians traded language and culture with other cultures, they wrote that symbol in different orientations, and it eventually found its way 180 degrees around to the Roman A. So you can spin this disc, and it talks a little bit about the different cultures and how they used it. The next few pictures there show some anatomy of letter forms. So the second slide there with ascenders and descenders, calling attention to those by having them pop off of the confines of the page. And then a few pieces where you can compare different typefaces. So you can see how the interior shape or the counter changes from one type of a typeface to another, looking at different weights and widths of a particular type family. And then the last slide there is has some pull tabs. And this is talking about ligatures. Ligatures are two or more characters that have been combined together to create a single unique character now for a variety of reasons, but you can pull that tab and it joins the two letters together. So this was a very like practical application of using moving parts. And I'm going to show you more of an artistic interpretation that uses structure. So this piece here is called Chronotopic Cartographies, and it was commissioned by the University of Lancaster in England. Their Department of English was doing a research project that was looking at landscape and environment and how real or imaginary that was in fiction. And they came up with 6 different categories of fictionality. So they asked me to create an artist book that could represent those 6 different states. So the structure is just a simple accordion. On the right side, you see it all compressed flat, and on the left, you see it start to be pulled apart, but you can expand it totally and you can kind of wrap it in different configurations. But I'll read through for you the 6 different layers so you can kind of see how I illustrated each of their concepts into this setting here. So starting at the foreground there, crumbled ancient ruins represent a space that once did exist in the real world, but no longer does. Beyond that, a hillside village represents a real historical place in the world. A distant bridge symbolizes a journey between a real world setting and an imaginary space. Then we have a towering mountain represents a topographical element deemed to be real, but is not place specific. Then billowing clouds symbolize an imaginative region integrating real and fictional space. And finally, beyond that, a starry cosmos represents a fictional universe that has no direct point of reference in the world. So it's kind of a scale for them. The next work kind of combines the two. It's a informational book, but in sort of an artistic sculptural form. This is called The Deep, and it's a tribute to maritime folklore and tradition. So it's full of anecdotes, superstitions, and legends around the sea, ships, and sailors. The structure of it is a circular accordion. It unfolds into a 6-foot diameter compass rose. So this is a big guy here. Each of you can see the compass is divided into 8 different segments. Each one of those segments holds a different category of nautical folklore. So on the right side there, you can see a category called Denizens of the Deep. It's about, sea monsters, krakens, mermaids, sirens, etc. The typography here is all set in the style of a late 19th century newspaper, because that was sort of really the last time when many of these stories would have been considered credible before modern science and reason provided explanation as to some of these natural phenomena observed at sea. So the book all folds down into a wedge shape. You can see there at the bottom left, and it tucks into this kind of anchor-shaped box. Weighs about 12 pounds altogether. This was an edition of 10 here. And then the last piece I'm going to show you is something that I've been working on for quite some time. A little embarrassed to tell you I've been working on it for 7 years. I get frustrated with it and I put it on the shelf and then I pick it up a few months later. But this is a book that is based on a bit of folklore around Stirling Castle in Scotland that you can see up at the top right there. In the early 16th century, a mysterious man arrived at the castle claiming to be, among other things, an alchemist. And he rose in favor with King James IV, and he conducted a series of bizarre experiments, the most famous of which was he built a set of wings and he jumped off one of the castle walls in an attempt to fly over the countryside. The castle sits up on this big rocky crag. Well, the experiment did not go so well. And he was famously mocked in a poem written by his court rival, a Scottish poet by the name of John Dunbar. And he wrote this poem that talks about his rise in power to the court and then his fall off this wall. And he's attacked by birds on the way down because he's mocking them with his artificial wings. So on the left side there, you see some of the different studies that I've done. The top two images there, that's a sewn structure, two different sewn structures. It's about 20-ish inches tall. And the idea is that you read a translation of this poem as you go around and up the book to the castle. And then you read about his descent and fall as he's attacked by all these birds as you go back down the other side. The third image over there is a completely different structure. This one is woven instead of being sewn. And then the bottom left there, you can see an overhead view, so you can kind of see the complexity of the structure and a couple of pop-up studies. So eventually there'll be some pop-ups at the top so you can actually see some details of the castle, and you'll see him potentially jumping off the wall there. But it's kind of a long gestating project, so still working on this, but to come sometime soon, hopefully. So I'm gonna stop my talk there, because Shawn is going to pick up where I left off. So the books I had went up to the 20th century, and I know Shawn's going to show some that get you into the 20th century.
Thank you, Kevin. Indeed, we talked about this, so we got ourselves organized. And Kevin covered the early movables, and I'm going to cover some later pop-ups. And Kevin is running my tech for me. Thank you, Kevin. And so let's do slide. And I found my way into making pop-ups when I was a student of graphic design as well. And I was basically solving a problem for a late in the program design class, and this was my solution. And so all of the images are developed through paper cuts, and it's that same sort of fan folded structure that pops up on each page, and then it has a different image mounted to it. And because I was a design student, and because it was the early 90s, you know, it's all bad printer and rubber cement, and I didn't know how to bind a book, and so you can see the little inset that shows the whole thing just sort of slowly eating itself and falling apart. But it was a terrific experience, and was received in a very encouraging way. And ultimately, it's what got me a fellowship to go to grad school and study book arts. Slide, please. And so I headed to Columbia College in Chicago to the book arts program. And the only pop-up that I built when I was in the program was basically a reworking of that very same book, because it seemed very interesting to me to think about that project, but redoing it as an edition. So there's multiple copies as opposed to the first version only having one copy. And then, you know, thinking about the project in terms of editioning. And so I'm not paper cutting, but instead I'm linoleum block printing for the imagery, and moving away from so much careful symmetry and something that's a little more dynamic and obviously a little more colorful. And then it's also letterpress printed, and it's all handmade paper, and it's properly bound. And it was also a very good experience. And I thought, I want to do this now much more. And so launched into basically a career where I've been making pop-up books and teaching about pop-up books ever since. But let's talk a little bit about some of the things that float around in my head when I'm working from a historical point of view. Slide, please. And I pulled 5 samples out, and I'm going to noticeably be shifting from me just talking to you conversationally to reading, because I don't have a good history brain, so I have to read details to you off of my page here. But I've included here first Harold Lentz in the Pop-Up Pinocchio, 1932. Harold Lentz worked for a company called Blue Ribbon Books. And Lentz is the guy who is credited with first using the expression pop-up book. Before, they sort of generally referred to them as self-erecting structures, which is not nearly as fun, especially if you're selling a book for kids. And he was among the first to create movable books in the US. And it was all an effort to help the publishing world recover from the Depression. Over the course of 3 years, he developed 10 titles, including this Pinocchio, and then he was out. So he had a very brief career, but he was very important. Slide. Louis Giraud and the Buchanan stories, of which you're seeing number 10 here, which was published in 1943. Giraud actually got started earlier than Lentz, but this specific book post-dates the previous, and so I wanted to put the books in order. I selected this one specifically because it's got that nice fan-folded structure and the tail of the peacock, kind of like you saw in the pop-up book that I made that I shared with you before. Giraud was a UK newspaper publicist, and he is credited, along with Thomas Brown, for creating the first self-erecting paper mechanisms. So Giraud is actually one of the first to make a pop-up book, even though they didn't call them pop-up books quite yet. Bucano is a portmanteau of book and meccano. The series of 17 books was produced between 1929 and 1949, all printed and hand-assembled in England. So we're all going to take a little pause now and let the World War, the Second World War, pass us by. And Kevin, slide please. When pop-up books started to become produced again in the US after taking a break because folks had more different things to focus on, especially industry. Waldo Hunt, as a producer, was one of the very first to bring pop-up books back into use in the US. And it was all primarily in service of marketing. And so this Bobby Bear is from a series of books, and you can see our character there to the right of the tree, who has a very thin body, because he's actually an anthropomorphic stick of chewing gum, Wrigley. And this is part of a 14-piece promotional series, and one of the first created by Waldo Hunt's company, Graphics International. Hallmark purchased Graphics International in the late 1960s, and shortly after, Hunt founded Intervisual Books. So Hunt shifted out of marketing and into publishing, and he published nearly 1,000 books by the late 1990s. So a very important figure in US pop-up production. Slide, please. Wojtek Kubaszta and his Goldilocks and the Three Bears that you see featured here with a printing date of 1977. Kubaszta was a Czech artist, and he designed his very first fairy tale pop-up book in 1956. And it was with a relationship with a Prague-based publishing house called Artia. In the years that followed, Kubaszta's three-dimensional books made him Artia's best-known book designer and illustrator. His books have been published in 24 languages, and 35 million copies have been sold. It's still very easy to even get your hands on a copy of a Kubaszta if you're a casual collector and would like to have one of these in your hands. Slide, please. So finally, I want to look at Yampankowski, who worked on this project called Haunted House, was published in 1979. And this pop-up book was produced by Intervisual, which you will recall is the publishing company of Waldo Hunt from 2 books back. And the paper engineer for this book is a guy named Tor Lupvig, who also was very active in the later mid 20th century as a paper engineer. And this specific book was so successful that Intervisual Books reproduced this book as part of its 1992 annual report. And the report notes that Haunted House was first published in 1979, has sold 1,083,366 copies in 13 languages to nearly 30 countries worldwide. And Haunted House earned Yampankowski his second Kate Greenaway Medal. Slide, please. So those kinds of structures that you just saw, pop-ups that are actuated when the page is turned and tend towards being sculptural, dimensional, and that's the area where I work pretty much entirely. Especially, I have been for a while. I'm ready to pivot maybe a little bit, but that's what's exciting to me. Building things that look sculptural and representational. And so, as Beth mentioned earlier in that portion of my bio, where I am thinking about creating ecologies in my books, there's a lot of pleasure for me in creating animals in pop-up form. And there's also a lot of pleasure in engineering those books so that there's a sense of movement as those forms are actuated as the page turns, just to help bring a little bit more life into the pages of the book. Slide, please. Here's another spread from that book, Welcome to the Neighborhood, a pop-up book of animal architecture, which came out in 2003. And there was kind of a meta game for me in creating this book, because it's a book of animal architecture. So, I'm building these things and I'm building these animals, and then these animals are builders. So I'm sort of building the buildings that these animals are making, and that was just fun. I have kind of a strong personal pride in this honeybee structure. It was a little tricky to figure out, and it really makes me happy the way that it moves, the way that it works. Slide, please. So then, 12 years later, I was delighted to have that book picked up by Candlewick and turned into a trade pop-up book. So here's that very same spread, that honeybee spread, recreated. And in Candlewick, when they chose this book to recreate in trade form, they were interested in the content, they were interested in the pop-ups, but they were also really interested in the fact that the book was made out of handmade paper, that original artist book version that you saw earlier. And so they really wanted me to recreate that in the trade book version. So, it's back to the papermaking studio and making all of these sheets again so that all of the models could be built from handmade paper. All the artwork for the models could be built from handmade paper. Then ultimately, that all got scanned and then printed onto commercial stock. So it looks like handmade paper, but it's not. Slide, please. I also then did a sort of post to that Welcome to the Neighborhood book, this one, Beyond the Sixth Extinction, a Fifth Millennium Bestiary, which came out in 2007. And it's a little bit of a post-apocalyptic thing, and where the previous book is sort of Midwest broadly, this next book is centered more specifically in Chicago, which is where I am located and from where I am speaking to you right now. And so this book kind of takes a look at what animals might survive a coming apocalypse and how they might adapt and make themselves useful in a new world. Slide, please. You saw a roach in that first slide. Here you see a snapping turtle that sort of evolves forward into this more dragon-like alpha predator creature. Frequently, I look at this as my favorite pop-up book, pop-up from this book. I just love how elegant that little guy is floating in the water. And I like the fact that it's got this sort of two-layer sense. Most of the turtle's body is above the water level, but you can see his feet underneath. Slide, please. Candlewick also picked up Beyond the Sixth Extinction for trade publication, and you see the roach model in the photo here. And that happened just a couple years ago that came out. And they again were very keen on maintaining the look of the handmade paper. So it was the same approach to creating the artwork. They also made it bigger than the original version. So all of these creatures in the book are a little more massive than they were in the original. And they hired an illustrator, Jordi Soldano, whose name you might be able to see, tiny, and the tiny inset down there. And so Jordi illustrated some pages that follow my pop-up pages to kind of help build the story just a little bit. Slide, please. And that's my website if y'all want to visit me and come look at more stuff. Thank you very much, Kevin. That is the end of that. And I'll pivot back to Beth.
Shawn and Kevin, thank you so much. Oh, where am I? There I am. Thank you so much for your presentations. We do have a couple of questions, and there may be more now that you've finished the speaking part. There's one from the chat that I noticed. Someone asked, are pop-up books hard to make?
Kevin. Yeah, I think in the short answer to that is yes, they are hard to make.
Yes.
It starts with, you know, learning basic fundamental principles behind how pop-ups work. And then it's about combining them in different ways. And I think the way that, I don't know about Shawn, but kind of the way that I've learned and a lot of people learn, you can see the bookshelf behind me, there's a lot of pop-up books in there. And if you're a librarian, cover your ears for a second, but a lot of those books have been dissected. You know, I'll just buy like used copies on eBay of pop-up books, dissect them to learn how they're put together, how the mechanisms work, and then re-put it back together. And just sort of over time, you learn, oh yeah, that's a structure that I could adapt for what I'm trying to build over here. So short answer, yes, they are, but you can do it.
And kind of what Kevin is telling you when he says that is that it's really not possible to go through a program of formal study in paper engineering. So most paper engineers are self-taught. I would also say that much of the process of developing a pop-up is trial and error. So even though you've got some good examples and you've got some good ideas of strategy, you're still spending a lot of time at the bench just kind of cutting and pasting and experimenting and refining over many, many iterations to get to the spot where you got something that looks good and works.
Great. Someone asked, Kevin, where can you see the Astronomical Cesarean? And are there digital resources for books books with Fauvel's, I assume, that you can find online?
I don't have a list of all the libraries that have Astronomicum, but I think it's fairly easy to find if you go to a special collections library. I know we had one at Indiana University, and I don't know if Emory has one, but there's, as I said, there's about 100 copies known worldwide of that. There's also just a trade publication sort of reproduction of that. I don't think it has the moving parts, but if you just want to be able to see it a little bit better, you could look at that as well. And it's pretty well documented online as well. And then Beth, sorry, what was the question about Fauvel's, the second part of that?
They were just asking about digital resources to see if they could see it online, I think.
Okay, yeah, it's pretty well documented online from various libraries and institutions that have copies of it. there's videos on YouTube as well that showed in great detail.
Question, do you each have a favorite pop-up or book illustrator? Or a favorite pop-up artist, maybe?
Right. Okay, so Kevin, I'll jump in. The thing that is, in fact, let me go get it because it's right here around the corner. One of my favorite and most recent books, because of course, frequently you love most what is the most dear and new. And let me jump over and turn on the desk here. So David Pelham, who's been a paper engineer for decades, did a version of Poe's The Raven. These lovely woodcut illustrations that have been then incorporated into paper engineered structures. And what I love the most about this book is our spread here, where this hand just sort of unfurls slowly to reveal a held locket. It's so beautifully engineered, and it moves so beautifully. I love it. Kevin.
Yeah, I think actually I would pick, there's a book that we were seeing on the slideshow at the beginning by two French collaborators. It's Anouk Bois-Robert and Louis Regard. I have one of their books. It's not the most elaborate one. This one's a pretty simple, the structures are pretty simple, but they have these really just beautiful, simple children's illustrations. The one that we were looking at before is about, I think it's a city that overtakes a forest or vice versa, but they have some really ingenious yet simple structures and some really complementary illustrations to go with that.
Great. In the age of digitization, can you say a few words about the appeal of movable books and their haptic qualities? And then also, who is the primary audience for the handmade books? Collectors?
Primary audience for handmade books is special collections libraries, the people who manage them at universities. Far and away, over 90% of my books sell to university libraries.
And in response to the question about, how do pop-ups fit into the world of digitization? Well, I just pulled out a book from that was paper engineered by our friend Simon, and let me just find a fancy thing here. But when you're looking at a PDF online, like that doesn't happen when you're looking at a digital book. There's something really special about it and tactile, and it asks you to engage. And there's often pieces that you can turn and flap, and it responds to you, and you just don't get that with a flat digital file.
But there's also some really great work that's being done in efforts to sort of capture that. It's not as good, of course, get the real book. But the University of Florida at Gainesville, Kate Smith, they're doing a lot of work in trying to capture all of that, the dimension and the movement, both as a resource, but also as a way of maintaining a record of that book. It's pretty interesting.
And there's also several pop-up artists that are working with things like augmented reality. So you'll open up a pop-up book and you'll aim your phone at it, and there'll be animated content that appears to be happening on the page itself, or a little animated clip or something will happen. So there's people that are blending digital technologies with actual tangible paper structures.
I'm going to skip over to the chat for a minute because there's just a question. What are some of the more obscure concepts that can be more effectively expressed in a pop-up form than in 2D pages?
Well, I think a lot of the examples that I was showing at the beginning are like excellent examples of communicating things about science. So we saw books about anatomy, astronomy, calendars, different types of sciences, things that you can just, like the Euclid book, you can immediately understand something better if, you just pop this flap up, you can understand like the Pythagorean theory because you can see all 3 points, and you might not get that when it's just printed flat. So I think there's lots of applications you can still use as an aid in education.
And a big part of the general artist book movement, which is, several decades old at this point, is the idea that a book can communicate through many different channels, and in many ways, the artist book movement, it was a response to digitization of the word and folks moving to spending a lot more screen time. And so having something that has a more tactile experience has an appeal. But we think, of the various channels which you can use to communicate with an artist's book. And text obviously is one, and image obviously is another, and structure is an important third. So like Kevin was talking about, having these ways that you can manipulate the book to help communicate a concept, the structure is pivotal to some of those. But there's also ways that you can manipulate a sense of time as you're turning through a book that's useful. And like I mentioned earlier, with attempts to incorporate a sense of animation in a pop-up also is a way that you can communicate in 3 dimensions that you can never do in 2 dimensions.
Okay. Says, we have a question that says, hi, Shawn, Kevin, I'm a budding paper engineer and would like to learn how to go about finding a printing company that specializes in printing die cuts for pop-up books. Do you have any recommendations?
You can find, I don't know where the question is coming from. You can find lots of printers can do die cuts. It's usually the assembly that's the more complicated part, and most of that these days goes overseas to China, Thailand. I think a little bit goes to South America, but Shawn, I don't think there's anybody currently operating on a large scale in the US that's assembling.
And I mean, Kevin mentions that it's possible, but dies are disastrously expensive to build. And many times you have to print many copies of a book to pay for the production costs that are involved, one of which is the die making. I once approached a die maker to make a die for me, and they said, not only can would we build the die, but we'd also have to build the tools that we would need to make the die for you, and you can't afford us, so go away. But there's a company called Red Paper Plane, and Kevin, maybe you can say more about Red Paper Plane, because I don't have any direct experience of them, but I know that they're a US producer that's really sort of interested in helping people realize ideas.
Mm-hmm. And if you're, there's also our friend Roston with Proposition Press in Colorado. He, the first few books that he published, they were all laser cut, like at his home and hand assembled by him and his brother. Now he's big enough that he could send it overseas for production. But if you're starting small and it's your first thing, I encourage you to find some ways to sort of work nimbly. And we certainly all just start with X-Acto knives ourselves.
And someone mentioned in the chat using Cricut for a prototype scale. And I know, Shawn, you use a Cricut for some of your prototyping and work.
Cricut comparable, yeah.
Well,
hold
similar.
Your eyes for a second as we'll do some motion sickness experiences, and I'll scan over there to my little cutter, the old school cutter and the new school cutter sitting right next door to one another. Yeah. It's a blade, a little robot blade, basically.
We had a question, I'm going to generalize a little bit. If people have sort of kids pop-up books or older pop-up books in their collections? And do those things retain any value, or are they just sort of family heirlooms? Are they just fun to play with?
So in my role as the director of the Movable Book Society, I'm the guy that often receives that query, which is, I have a collection that I'd like to sell at great profit to an institution that will buy it in its entirety and take care of it forever. And basically, it doesn't really happen. A lot of people have been collecting for, the past 20, 30 years or so. We've all been collecting the very same books, and they've all been really well made recently. So there's no preciousness to that. They're not rare. They're not valuable. But if you've got something that's, pre-1970s, pre-1960s, that's in good condition, and if it has a dust cover, a dust jacket, you're starting to get into the territory of something that might have a little bit of collector's value. And it's still a hard road to hoe, though.
Okay. I think we've come to the end of our immediate questions. Let me double check the chat. Someone asked, I don't know about letterpress, but here it is used. Please explain, and where can I find one?
So a letterpress is letterpress is a form of relief printing where you have individual pieces of type. So there'll be a metal piece of type for a letter A and a letter B, et cetera. And you have thousands of these different pieces, and you combine them to make paragraphs of text that you set on a press bed, and you ink it. And it's a big, gigantic, heavy piece of machinery to print that. And there's obviously some skill that comes with that. There's lots of, local book and printing centers that offer classes in letterpress to kind of get started. But it's essentially the same process as linoleum printing. So if you're interested in starting with something a little simpler and without, getting involved with all that machinery, you can start learning about relief printing through something like lino cuts.
Great. All right. I think we have reached the end.